It's time for another project here in the Woodsmith shop. Now, a bookcase can be as simple and as boring as a box with some shelves in it. On today's episode, we're going all out and building this Greene Greene style bookcase. There are a lot of details to take in here and a lot of parts to savor, so we're going to stretch this out over 2 parts. On today's episode, we're going to build the basic case for the project. And then next time when we gather, we're going to build the doors and the drawers for it. Now, the Greene Greene style is defined by rich, dark materials like this mahogany with contrasting elements like the splines and the plugs in the doors and in the case itself. You'll also see a lot of offset surfaces and changes in profile like the cloud lift detail that you'll see on the doors. We've thrown in a few other details of our own, like the pebbled glass here, and then the rich wood finish.
This Greene Greene style bookcase isn't your average bookcase, and the construction isn't average either. So let's take a look at it. The Greene Greene style features frame and panel construction, but it's a little bit different than standard frame and panel. We have these hardwood corner posts, and then we have a series of rails on the side panels. Now, these rails are hardwood as well, but the panels themselves are actually going to be mahogany plywood. And these rails are offset from the outside edges of these corner posts. So what that all means is we're going to have a series of mortises and grooves in each of these legs. And each one of those legs are going to be slightly different than the other set that's in the back or the front. So what this means is we're going to have a lot of mortising and a lot of grooves to make. So I'm going to head over to the bench and get the mortising machine set up to start these mortises. Now, these posts on this bookcase are going to require a little bit of layout for the mortises. And because each one of these legs is a little bit different than its counterpart, we need to make sure that we label them. So what I've done here is I've labeled the end of each leg in its proper location. So front left, front right, back left, and back right. And then we spent a little time laying out all these mortises. We have mortises in each of the legs for the side rails, both top, middle, and bottom, and for the front and back rails, top, middle, and bottom as well. Now, it's important to note that these corner posts are different width and thicknesses. So they're actually rectangular. So we need to make sure that everything stays in the proper orientation as we're cutting the mortises. So to cut these mortises, what we're going to do is cut them at the mortising machine. Now, a mortising machine combines the functionality basically of a drill press with the center auger bit and a square chisel. So as I plunge this bit into the wood, not only is it going to hog out the waste, but it's going to create a square hole. Now, a mortising machine isn't a tool that we use every day, but when we need to cut mortises in a dense hardwood, like mahogany, it's invaluable. Especially when you consider picking one of these up on the used market can be done fairly inexpensively, and when you're not using it, the small size stashes away pretty easily. So now that we have these all laid out, I can go ahead and set the fence. And we're going to reference off of the outside face. And this fence sets the position of the workpiece in relation to the bit. So we'll go ahead and bring the bit down. There we go. Now we'll lock the fence in place. And now the only thing left to do is to go ahead and set the bit depth. Now we just stop here. There we go. That's all the deeper the bit can go now. So now we're ready to cut these mortises. Well, let's talk about how this process is going to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this hole down, and that's going to help keep the workpiece from lifting up as I retract the bit. And I'll make a plunge down on one end of the mortise, and then I'll slide the workpiece down to the other end, and I'll define that end as well. Then it's just a matter of stepping this bit all the way down and connecting those two end marks. I'm going to do that on all of the mortises on all these legs. But remember, because these are different dimensions, I'm going to have to reset this up once I roll the legs to do the inside mortises. So with our mortises done, we now have to cut some tenons to fit. Now we have 3 different size rails here. We have a narrow top rail. We have a little bit wider middle rail, which is actually going to be a little bit lower down here on the leg. And then we have a wide lower rail. So we have to cut tenons to fit. And to do that, I've loaded up a dado blade, and I've set the fence to create a tenon that's 1 inch long. This dado blade is set at 1/4 inch high. That way it's going to produce a tenon that's going to be 1/2 inch thick. After cutting both faces, I'm going to flip this up on edge and raise the blade up to create a 1/2 inch shoulder on the top and bottom of each of these pieces. So now that our rails fit into our legs, we have to take care of adding a groove for the plywood panels. And to do that, I've set up a 1/4 inch bit here at the router table. Now we have to route from mortise to mortise. We're going from the top mortise up here all the way down to the bottom mortise. That's because we have 2 different plywood panels. We have an upward plywood panel that's a little bit longer, and then we have this little stubby guy that will be down here on the bottom side. So to do this, I'm going to start with the router bit running, and I'm going to drop this post over the bit. And I'm starting in that mortise, so I'm not going to cut anything when I drop it over there. Then I'm going to route from right to left, and then I'm going to end up hitting this middle mortise, and I'm going to continue on until I hit the bottom mortise. And after I have that done on all 4 legs, I'm going to grab the back 2 legs. And that's because on the back 2 legs, we need to make room for the plywood back panels as well. Once I have all the routing done on these corner posts, we can go ahead and take care of the rails. Because of course we're routing grooves in these corners for the plywood panels, we need matching grooves in the edges of the rails as well. So I'm going to install a rail, mark the groove location, then reset up this router fence to cut those grooves in the rails. Once those are done, we can go ahead and head over the table saw and cut the rabbets in the plywood panels to fit in this. So the final thing to take care of before we assemble these side assemblies is going to be to cut a groove for the divider and the bottom of the bookshelf. Now these are going to be 3/4 inch wide to hold plywood panels. So I found the key to a successful glue up is pre-checking everything, rechecking it, making sure you have your parts, rechecking it again, and then making sure you have everything again. So I have tested these rails. The grooves all line up nicely. I've made sure that the rails that I marked to go with the respective legs are with the respective legs. So I think at this point we're ready to glue this up. So we're going to go really gently on the glue, just a little bit in the mortise and some on the tenon. And we're going to start by putting these rails in one of these corner posts or legs first, and then sliding all of the rails in place, and then the plywood panels capping it by the other post. Okay, there we go. I'm gonna let this glue skim over for a little bit and then come back and clean up any squeeze out. Then I'll go ahead and get this other side assembled, and then we can go ahead and start working on those front and back rails. So the front and back rails follow a similar path that we did for the side rails. First, they get a tenon cut on the ends. After the tenon's cut and everything's fitting, we need to also route grooves for the back panels. So these are just going to be in those back rails. The fronts don't get the grooves. Now the only thing we have left to do is create a rabbet in them. And this is a little bit different than we did in the side rails. The rabbet is going to be in the middle and lower rails, And those are going to be to hold the plywood dividers that we'll add in a little bit. So I've set up a dado blade. It's sized for the plywood panels once again. And here, I'm just going to run the workpiece up along this auxiliary fence and cut that rabbet. The final parts to our case are going to be a pair of plywood panels. These plywood panels are going to form the bottom and top of the drawer cubby that will fill out later. Now these are simple plywood panels, but we do want to divide up that drawer cubby into two separate areas. So we've cut dado down the center here, and that's going to accept another plywood panel that's going to act like a divider. Once this is all glued up, we'll add some hardwood edging to cover up that plywood edge. Now to wrap these plywood panels around these corner posts, I went ahead and cut notches in them. These notches are going to wrap around the corners, but to really clean up the look, I did spend a little bit of time with the chisel. What I did with the chisel is I continued that groove that we cut in those side rails around the corner of those corner posts. And that is going to tuck that notch right in there, and it's going to give it a really good clean look once everything's assembled. So now at this point, we can start gluing everything up, but we do have an order of operations here. First, we're going to install these plywood panels. We're going to slip them into the grooves, tuck them into those corner posts, and then we're going to put that panel in place. And I will apply just a little bit of glue to kind of tack these in place. And then it's a simple matter of working down the front and back rails. We'll apply glue to the tenons, drive them home, and go to the next one. Once we have this one side done, I'll slip those plywood backs in place, and then I'll step onto a step stool to go ahead and apply glue to those top tenons, and then apply the other side. There we go. So now we're just going to go ahead and let this case dry, and once it is cured, it's off to Chris for some ebony accents.
Well, with the case done, it's time for us to move on to one of the details that makes Greene & Greene furniture so very interesting, so very endearing, and so much fun to build. And that is, it's time for us to start dealing with the ebony details. Now, there are going to be inserts in the pulls, door handles, and what there's going to be mostly is small 3/8 by 3/8 domed plugs that are placed around the joinery of the case, doors, and so forth. There's a lot of them. The case has 26 individual ebony plugs, 3/8 by 3/8 by about a 1/4 inch long. So we need to have a system to make all those plugs so that they're uniform and so that they look great. What I've got here is a piece of 3/8 by 3/8 Madagascar ebony. The first thing that I'm going to do is use some sandpaper, and I want to gently sand the end. Now I've got 80 grit, I've got some 150, and I have 220. So what I want is to get all the saw marks off of the end. Once that's done, I'm going to come over here to my 80 grit paper, and I'm going to make 2 strokes on either edge while I pivot the blank. And what that's going to do is gently round over the edge. And what I don't want is a tight pyramid, but I don't want a simple radius. It needs to be a little bit in between, more like a thumbnail. Now I'm going to move over to the 150 grit paper and do the exact same thing again. With that done, I can then take a piece of 220 hand sandpaper, and I just want to gently round over everything and take out any of the rougher sanding marks that have been left in our plug. There we go. So what I want is a nice soft appearance. Now, to cut these to length, it's best that we do this by hand. If you tried to cut something this small using a power equipment, it's going to be dangerous, and these plugs are going to end up all over your workshop and probably most of them shattered. So what I have here, this is an old shop notes project. It's a miter box, and it's meant to use a Japanese pole saw. And I love these Japanese pole saws because the teeth are so fine. It really works fantastic for cutting small parts. I have a stop block inserted, and so I'll butt the end of my blank firmly against the stop block. Get my saw into the kerf. And there we go. A 3/8 by 3/8 by 0.25 long ebony accent for the Greene Greene piece. Now all I need to do is make 26 of these, and then I'll be ready to start plugging the holes in the case. Well, now that we've created all those little ebony plugs, it's time for us to create some square holes for them to fit into. Now, there's a process to it, and it starts with some careful layout, because we need to make sure that we position these plugs in the exact spot. There's a lot of them, and they need to line up, and they need to look good. So what I've done first is I've gone ahead and measured from the top and the bottom of each of these rails, and I've got a layout line to place the hole vertically. To place the hole from front to back, I'm going to rely on a drilling guide. Now, you don't have to use a guide, but it's awfully handy. So what I have here is a drilling guide that's going to keep my drill bit perpendicular to the surface. I've got a fence which will bring it in exactly 1 1/8 inches. I'm using a 5/16 Forstner bit. Now, it's a 3/8 square plug that we have to fit, but I want to make sure that my clearance hole is a little bit less. So I'm just going to line things up. I have a stop because I need to make sure that the holes are of consistent depth. One of the things that's going to be important is that each of these plugs seats at about the same depth. If one is flush and one is high, it's going to show. So that consistency is important. With the holes drilled, what we want to do now is go from that round hole to a square hole. And to do that, I'm going to use this as an aid. This is a part of a mortising drill bit from a mortising machine. Now, there are special 4-sided chisels made specifically for this type of work, but I'm going to go ahead and use part of this mortising drill bit, and that'll work just fine because it does have 4 sides. They're all sharpened, and it does a great job. One of the challenges, though, is to make sure that my chisel here is going to be parallel to the back of the case or the front, and I don't want it to tilt. So what I'm going to do is I've made a simple jig here to lean it up against, and that'll really help me out. So I'll go ahead and clamp this little block in place. To line up this chisel exactly with the hole. Take a wooden mallet, and there we go. As you can see, I now have a square-sided hole. I still need to clean it out, but I've got good square sides to guide me during the process. So I'm just going to use a 1/4-inch chisel and clean out each of these. And there we go. Next thing, I want to make sure I sand off my layout lines because it's a little easier to do it now than later. Well, now it's time to insert the 2 ebony plugs into these 2 holes. I'm going to put a little drop of glue on the back of each plug. Doesn't take much, just a tiny bit. I'll lay the plug over the hole and I'll gently tap it in. Well, there we are. There's our first 4 ebony plugs. So that only leaves 54 more to go. Well, with all the ebony plugs in place on the case, it's time to turn our attention to the top. The top consists of one large solid wood panel, but the ends are capped with a breadboard end. From there, there's more ebony accents which will be applied. But for right now, let's deal with the breadboard ends. 2 tasks. One is, on the inside edge of each breadboard end, I need to cut a mortise. And I'm going to go over to the router table and use a 3/8 inch straight bit in a couple of passes cut a deep mortise. Once that's done, I'll go to the table saw with this panel and begin to cut the tenon. I wanted to cut the mortise first because that way I can sneak up on a perfect fit using the dado blade and the table saw when creating this tenon. One of the things I wanted to do before we glued the top up was to deal with these ebony accents on our breadboard ends. Now, much like the little plugs that we used earlier on the case, these are simple plugs that go into a shallow mortise. I created these mortises on the router table though, using the same 3/8 bit that was used to create this deep mortise. It was just a matter of making some reference marks on my blank and reference marks on the router table so that I knew how long the length of each mortise was. With that done, I went ahead and squared up the ends, cut plugs to fit, and just like with the little plugs, we softened the edges first, a little glue, tapped them in place. Another item to deal with is on the front edge of our top. There's a long key of ebony with a slight cloud lift pattern to it. Now, if you'll notice on the end of this breadboard end, I've pre-cut a slot to accommodate that key. And if we look at the center of our top, you'll notice that same extension of that slot. We're not going to put that key in now. We're going to wait till after the glue up, and I'll explain why later. So let's go ahead and put some glue on and get this top done. The last little piece of ebony accent that we're going to use on our top is the key that fits between the main solid wood blank and the breadboard ends. So what I've done here is I have 2 pencil lines, and then there's a hole that I've pre-drilled as a transition point. So now I'm going to use the bandsaw, and I'm going to go ahead and cut our straight portion of the key, and then I'll take each of these keys back to the bench, clean them up with a file, some sandpaper, and they'll be ready to go into the top. Well, as you can see, I've completed the top. I've added these ebony keys, and they extend from the center solid wood portion of our top to the breadboard ends. Now, interestingly enough, they're only glued to this center panel, and that way, as it expands and contracts, it will actually float in and out of the slot that we've put on the end of the breadboard end. And that'll keep things looking good for years to come. So, the top is screwed down, the case is complete, we're ready to move on to doors and drawers.
As you can see, there's a lot of detail that goes into a bookcase project, much less one that's going to be as impressive as this. That's why we're splitting it up into 2 parts. On the second part, we'll tackle the stuff that really makes this project stand out, the drawers for the bottom and the 2 doors up top. There's a lot to cover there too.